Welcome back. This is a place for quiet stories from the wizarding world. The paths canon never walked. The choices that might have changed everything. Here, we take a single moment and turn it slightly. We follow the consequences, slowly, carefully, year by year. If you enjoy these long, immersive journeys into alternate magic, consider subscribing and settling in. Now, let's start. The wizarding world operates under a quieter delusion in this timeline. That Hermione Granger, brightest witch of her age, will of course stand in a muddy field beside Harry Potter when the war finally demands her. They are wrong. Imagine the familiar image shattered. No damp tent, no hunted trio living off desperation and stolen rations. Instead, a polished ministry office, high above the atrium's echoing silence, where Hermione sits beneath the crest of institutional authority, quill in hand, signing decrees that decide who lives openly, who hides in cellars, and who, with a stroke of ink, simply disappears from the record. The world thinks it has kept her safe. In reality, it has handed its sharpest mind to a bureaucracy at war. In this timeline, the wizarding world does not lose Hermione to death, exile, or Azkaban. It loses her to procedure, parchment, and power. The Order of the Phoenix forfeits its most tactically lethal strategist. The Ministry gains a weapon it does not fully understand, a weapon being polished in the dark by committee meetings, policy drafts, and emergency regulations. What Harry will later face is not only Death Eaters in masks, but memoranda bearing her precise handwriting. The divergence is deceptively simple. When the Second War crests, when Dumbledore falls, and the Ministry begins its slide into open authoritarianism, Hermione looks at the chaos of open rebellion and the cold machinery of the state, and chooses the machine. She joins not as a coward, but with methodical certainty, entering magical law enforcement or the regulation of magical creatures with the same exam-perfect focus she once brought to OWLs. She tells herself that someone rational must sit at the desk where the decrees are drafted. She volunteers to be that rationality. Very quickly, the resonance of that choice spreads. The girl who once knitted hats for house elves now writes the legal language that defines which non-human entities may be relocated for their own security. The teenager who spat in Umbridge's face through Dumbledore's army now perfects the loopholes that make blood status registration technically voluntary, yet practically unavoidable. Each clause is a compromise. Each compromise builds a fortress of paper around the regime. The Order finds itself fighting on two fronts: masked assassins in the alleyways, and a system whose edges have been honed by Hermione's intellect. Warrants arrive faster. Raids become surgically precise. Safe houses that would once have slipped through procedural cracks are exposed by a single new form, a single redefined term. This is the Slytherin timeline, without Slytherin's banner. The cunning has simply moved to the letterhead. Yet, this is not simple betrayal. Hermione's sole resonance has always been with rules, with the belief that structures can be repaired rather than burned. She tells herself, in late-night solitude over piles of parchment, that by mastering the rules, she is saving more people than she could with a wand and a cloak. At what point does working inside the system cease to be resistance and become collaboration? She does not notice the line until she has already crossed it. Across this video, We will track that crossing step by step. The moment she turns toward the ministry, the career that follows, the friendships that fracture, and the war that mutates around her. We will follow her to the final decision that will define her legacy, whether she dies a reformer, a tyrant, or something more unsettling still. A tragic bureaucrat history cannot quite condemn and cannot forgive. The divergence. The night Hermione chooses law over loyalty. The moment does not happen on a battlefield. It happens at a kitchen table. In the late, airless weeks after Dumbledore's death, the burrow becomes a beleaguered fortress, pretending to be a family home. The Order crowds its mismatched chairs, Molly's tea goes cold between untouched biscuits, and the adults outline what they call a plan. Hermione listens. She hears something, closer to a last stand, scribbled on a napkin. On parchment, the strategy sounds heroic. Harry will vanish to hunt Horcruxes. Ron and Hermione will go with him. The Order will hold the line against a ministry already sliding under Death Eater control. In canon, we accept this as inevitable, even noble. In this timeline, Hermione's mind refuses to cooperate. She has seen this ministry deny Voldemort's return under Fudge, weaponize pink stationery through Umbridge, and try to recruit Harry as a mascot under Scrimgeour. The pattern is not subtle. Chaotic heroics flare, burn out, and leave the same institutions intact. They are wrong, she realizes. Not about Voldemort's evil, but about the scale of the problem. The enemy is not only a snake-faced wizard and his masked followers. It is the legal scaffolding that let him rise, the blood status decrees, the silent complicity of forms in triplicate. The war is being fought with wands, but it was prepared with paperwork. This is where the ledger begins. Hermione has always counted House Elf heads on SPEW badges, OWL, scores, minutes, until curfew. Now the counting turns predatory. In the dim kitchen, as Moody growls about decoys and Lupin talks about buying time, she starts a mental accounting of risks, lives, and probabilities. One column for the Horcrux hunt. 3 teenagers, no institutional backing, hunted by a surveillance state but already knows their faces. Another for a targeted infiltration of the ministry. One witch with a perfect academic record, a reputation for rule following, and a mind that can memorize entire legal codes. Where does her marginal impact spike? Behind a wand in the woods, or behind a desk with access to the levers of authority? The ledger answers with methodical certainty. Harry is the symbol. The war will orbit him whether she stands at his side or not. Ron is his anchor. What he does not have is someone to rewire the machine that will still be standing if he wins. Hermione feels, with a cold, almost mathematical soul resonance, that the brightest witch of her age is being wasted as third wand in a tent. In this timeline, she reframes herself, not the heart of a trio of rebels, but a weapon being polished in the dark, a self-forged instrument of systemic change. She is not abandoning Harry and Ron. She is reallocating herself, she tells the ledger, to the front that no one else is equipped to fight. Someone must become fluent in the language of decrees, exemptions, and emergency powers, must learn how to break laws by writing new ones. That night, long after the Order disperses, Hermione sits alone at the scrubbed wooden table, and performs the most Slytherin act of her Gryffindor life. She writes 2 letters. The first is to Harry and Ron. It is careful, half-truth, layered over omission, speaking of another path she has to explore, of a way to protect you from a distance, of research that can only be done within the system. She lets the ink blur once, then corrects it. Sentiment is permitted, explanation is not. The second is shorter and infinitely more dangerous. Addressed to Kingsley Shacklebolt at the Auror office, still technically part of the Ministry, it requests a private meeting to discuss strategic legal resistance to Voldemort's influence. The phrasing is dry, bureaucratic, almost dull. It is a masterpiece to be moulded into whatever Kingsley needs it to be. When she seals it, the wax bears the Ministry's own crest from a borrowed stamp. The owl launches into a brewing storm, the emblem catching a flash of lightning mid-flight. We do not hear Harry read her goodbye. We only watch the seal vanish into the dark and understand, with a chill, that the war has gained a tactically lethal bureaucrat, and the resistance has just lost Hermione Granger. What Kingsley does with that letter will decide whether she becomes a reformer, a collaborator, or something far more dangerous. From library to labyrinth, Hermione's first steps into the Ministry machine. Kingsley does not answer the letter with flowers and fanfare. He answers with a posting. The Ministry she walks into is not the gleaming atrium of her childhood awe. It is a fortress under siege, its marble floors dulled by too many hurried boots, its gilded statues half-shrouded by hastily erected security advisory placards. Memos do not glide. They swarm, sharp-edged paper birds, wings beating in frantic bureaucratic Morse code. Fear hums in the air conditioning. Denial is baked into the walls. Hermione catalogues it on sight. In this timeline, she is not overwhelmed by scale. She is dissecting an organism. Each corridor becomes a vein, each lift a clumsy synapse, each department a congested organ fighting systemic infection. The Ministry is sick, but it is also the only body with the circulatory reach to touch every witch and wizard in Britain. That paradox becomes her first emotional anchor, repulsion and reliance fused into a single, uneasy soul resonance. Kingsley places her, almost apologetically, in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, on a temporary wartime compliance subcommittee. On parchment, it is junior, peripheral, safe. In practice, it is where fear turns into forms, and forms turn into shackles. She reads every file as if it were a battlefield map. Every meeting is reconnaissance on how power actually moves when no one is looking. The world believes Hermione Granger joined the Ministry as a clerk. They are wrong. Kingsley becomes the human face of the institution in her life, the mentor through which the building itself seems to speak. He is a pragmatic idealist, a man who has watched the Slytherin timeline of Fudge and Umbridge nearly destroy the war effort, and concluded, with methodical certainty, that chaos will finish what Voldemort started. We need the Ministry, he tells her in a low, exhausted voice. If it falls, there's nothing left to inherit. His realism fascinates her. His compromises unsettle her. Yet she cannot deny the brutal calculus, an imperfect authority that still pays auras and regulates portkeys, is more tactically lethal than a dozen noble vigilantes operating out of safe houses and cellars. Here, her traits find their mirror. Hermione's lifelong devotion to rules, once an adolescent shield against a chaotic world, now stares back at her in the Ministry's obsession with procedure for its own sake. She wants justice. The building wants stability. She learns to speak its language fluently. Subclauses, exemptions, implementation guidance, even as, in the margins of draft legislation, she quietly rewrites the grammar. The first compromise looks harmless. A regulation on creature relocation during wartime crosses her desk, a tangle of vague phrases that could, in the wrong hands, justify mass displacement of goblins, werewolves, and any non-compliant beings. Hermione does not sign it as written. She improves it. She narrows definitions, clarifies enforcement powers, makes it, in her own precise phrase, more enforceable and therefore less abusable. The change that matters is 3 words: designated secure zones, a neat category that allows the Ministry to move vulnerable groups for their protection and keep them there until the war ends. She tells herself it is temporary, a shield against something worse, a weapon being polished in the dark, but in her hands, not Umbridge's. The quill scratches. Her signature settles at the bottom like a lead weight. Somewhere above, the memos change their flight pattern. The web has its first thread. What happens when the brightest witch of her age learns that every thread she pulls tightens the same net she plans to cut? Designing a legal weapon, Hermione's power system inside the Ministry. Hermione's first lesson is brutal in its simplicity. Signatures are spells that never fade. In this timeline, she decides that if decrees are going to carve up lives, then her hand needs to be the one holding the quill. From that decision, a new discipline crystallizes. Legislative drafting becomes her private branch of advanced magic, a branch no Hogwarts curriculum ever named. Each clause is a wand movement, each comma a pivot in reality. She learns that inserting "unless otherwise exempted by the Undersecretary" is the bureaucratic equivalent of a non-verbal countercurse, silent, invisible, but tactically lethal. The Ministry thinks it has acquired another bright graduate. They are wrong. It has acquired a weapon being polished in the dark, one that speaks in subparagraphs and schedules instead of incantations. Her canon traits do not vanish, they are repurposed. The meticulous notes that once documented homework now metastasize into a private archive of institutional weakness. Voting records, disciplinary histories, obscure precedents buried in yellowing Wizengamot minutes. Her exam obsession mutates into an almost monastic project of total legal mastery. She memorizes bylaws the way other witches memorize dueling forms, waking from shallow sleep with entire chains of precedent arranged in her mind like runes. By the time she's 20, she can out-argue Wizengamot elders in their own chambers, dismantling their authority with the very case law they once weaponized against Muggleborns. Her days become a ritual of conditioning, committee hearings in the morning, where she watches language hammered into law with all the delicacy of a bludger. Afternoons spent in windowless rooms, cross-referencing case law with war reports smuggled in from the field. Nights in a cramped flat, mapping cause and effect across timelines. One regulation here, a raid avoided there. One surveillance power delayed, a family spared. Slowly, she trains herself to think in systems, not individuals, trading the visceral urgency of saving one friend in a corridor for the cold arithmetic of protecting thousands through policy. To survive this, she builds an inner fortress. An inner ministry rises behind her eyes, corridors of statutes, archives of regulations, a central citadel where she can retreat and calculate. Empathy does not disappear. It is compartmentalized, filed like a restricted document. She learns to sit through meetings that would once have made her scream, listening to blood status metrics discussed like crop yields, while a second Hermione, the strategist, quietly rearranges the architecture of the proposal in her head. Law becomes both shield and blade, procedure as Protego, information control as a civilian Fidelius that hides vulnerable names in plain sight. The first real test arrives as parchment, a draft regulation for expanded monitoring of Muggle-born correspondence, crosses her desk, its language clean, its intent poisonous. The schoolgirl in her wants to burn it. The strategist uncaps her ink. Penalties are softened, automatic detentions transmuted into mandatory reviews, vague phrases inserted that create exploitable loopholes. On paper, she is tightening the net. In practice, she is filling it with holes only she and a handful of allies can see. To her, this is saving lives by degrees. To the outside world, the headline is simpler. Hermione Granger has put her name on oppression, in smaller font. The soul resonance between intention and outcome fractures, and somewhere, quietly, the war takes note. The question is no longer whether she can bend the system, it is how long she can keep bending it before it snaps back, and who will be standing on the other side when it does. A war without Hermione. How the resistance bleeds in the shadows. The war measures its losses in absences long before it measures them in bodies. Hermione's choice to walk into the Ministry's marble hall instead of Grimmauld Place does not explode the timeline in a single dramatic moment. It erodes it, grain by grain, until the resistance is fighting on a shoreline that no longer exists. Year one of open conflict begins with a tent. In canon, that tent becomes a mobile fortress of wards and logic, Hermione's planning turning exile into a campaign. In this timeline, it is canvas and cold air. Harry and Ron manage basic protections, but without her layered enchantments and methodical certainty, they are forever one step too visible, one charm too shallow. The Horcrux locket stays on Harry longer, its whispering malice unbuffered by Hermione's relentless insistence on rotation and routines. Paranoia ceases to be an influence and becomes an atmosphere. Dumbledore's clues, once decoded by Hermione's cross-reference brilliance, now sit like unsolved riddles on damp parchment. The symbol in Beadle the Bard remains a curiosity, not a Rosetta Stone. Xenophilius Lovegood's ramblings sound mad rather than strategic. Godric's Hollow still happens, but without Hermione's suspicion of the too-perfect graveyard and her instant counter-curses, the ambush is cleaner, crueler. Nagini strikes twice. Harry escapes with his face torn and wand snapped. Ron leaves a trail of blood across the snow that Death Eaters will later follow to a muggle-born safe house. The Ministry heist is no longer a daring incision. It is a botched surgery. Polyjuice gets them in, but Hermione is not there to anticipate the lift patterns, the paper aeroplane memos, the exact moment when panic must be weaponized as cover. They free some muggle-borns, not most. On the way out, a hex hits Dirk Cresswell in the back. In canon, he dies later, off-screen and defiant. But here, his body drops in the atrium, a public warning under greenish light. The trio barely escape at all, and the locket, clutched in Harry's fist, tightens its grip on his mind. Far from the tent, Hogwarts mutates into a different battlefield. The DA survives, but without Hermione's lists, schedules, and relentless follow-up. It is an underground in name and in practice, fragmented, brave, tactically lethal in moments, and disastrously sloppy in others. Ginny, Neville, and Luna improvise raids on the Carrow's authority, but attendance fluctuates. Security lapses, passwords are reused. A first-year Hufflepuff is crucioed into the hospital wing because someone spoke in the wrong corridor. The room of requirement feels less like a sanctuary and more like a crowded bunker, waiting to be mapped. The casualties ripple outward with a cold, impersonal resonance. A Muggle-born family Hermione once would have warned through the Order's channels is rounded up in a pre-dawn sweep. Their names appear briefly on a Ministry ledger she signs in triplicate, never seeing the connection. A key piece of research on Horcrux degradation, something only she would have cross-checked between ancient Cursebreaker notes and goblin metallurgy, never coalesces, leaving Harry to stab blindly at immortality rather than dismantle it with precision. By the war's midpoint, the vocabulary shifts. The Order no longer debates how to win. It debates how long it can hold out. Each failed mission, each missed signal, compounds like interest on a cursed debt. They are wrong to think this erosion is abstract. It has coordinates. In a dim safe house, Harry stands over a hand-drawn map of Britain, names inked in cramped script, red X's bleeding through the parchment where lives have ended or vanished. The silence is alpine, thin and unforgiving. We needed her, he says to no one, fingers hovering over Hermione Granger's name, carefully unmarked, circled twice. No one in the room knows where she is. No one can answer the quieter question hanging in the dark. When she finally chooses a side, will it still be theirs? The Ministry's new prodigy, Hermione's rise and the birth of a legal tyranny. Hermione Granger does not disappear in this timeline. She reappears with a Ministry ID badge and a probationary title that sounds smaller than it is. Junior Researcher, Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. On parchment, it is clerical. In practice, it is proximity to the levers of quiet violence. Her first school year in the Ministry is remedial work in institutional cruelty. She reads case files the way she once read textbooks, annotating margins with cross-references to obscure bylaws, international conventions, and forgotten Wizengamot rulings, house elf abuse reports, goblin contract disputes, werewolf relocation orders. She maps them all, building a lattice of cause and effect. The numbers are damning. The numbers are usable. Promotion comes as predictably as exam scores. By her second year, she is no longer just summarizing. She is advising. Policy drafts arrive at her desk with red ink already bleeding through them. Proposals for mass relocations, for expanded Auror discretion, for accelerated trials of suspected collaborators. Hermione does not throw them away. She rewrites them line by line, converting blunt force repression into something cleaner, more defensible, more efficient. On paper, her reforms are victories. Complaint processes for magical creatures are standardized, deadlines enforced, records centralized into a single enchanted registry that glows red when patterns of abuse emerge. She insists oral operations include written justifications, after-action reports, and independent review panels. She designs a data-driven framework to track dark artifacts, cross-referencing seizures, sightings, and black market whispers, until the Ministry can see the war as a moving constellation of risk. They call it transparency. It is also cartography. Every grievance, every wand, every whispered rumor of a safe house becomes a point on a map. Authority acquires X-ray vision. By her third year, Hermione has transferred to magical law enforcement. Her performance reviews a catalogue of methodical certainty. She drafts a Muggle-born registration framework that horrifies her in the abstract and reassures her in the details. Mandatory interviews, yes, but with guaranteed counsel. Registration, yes, but with explicit prohibitions on asset seizure and indefinite detention. She tells herself, with the weary logic of a strategist, that without her, the law would be a weapon being polished in the dark. Instead of a blunt instrument, she can at least blunt further. They are wrong, those who say she has crossed to the other side. She insists there are no sides inside a statute, only margins she can still edit. Yet every signature she adds to the bottom of a parchment drags the Overton window of the Slytherin timeline a few inches toward legalized tyranny, normalizing the idea that such laws can exist at all. Kingsley Shacklebolt watches this ascent with a veteran's unease. In quiet corridors and lift rides, he asks the questions no performance review will contain. How far can you bend the law before it stops being a shield and becomes a blade? Hermione answers with metrics, mitigations, footnotes. She does not answer with sleep. Her superiors, more Umbridge than Dumbledore, praise her pragmatism. They like that she speaks the language of rights, while delivering results that stabilize the fortress of the Ministry. Fewer public scandals, smoother arrests, a war that looks, from the outside, almost administratively tidy. The pattern interrupts on a Tuesday. A memo lands on her desk, parchment edged in the discreet silver thread that denotes time-sensitive field coordination. It requests her review to retroactively authorize a raid on a suspected insurgent safe house, citing her own oversight protocols as the standard to be met. Names are redacted, locations are blurred behind legal euphemism. But the description of the wards, the mention of a one-eared guard dog Patronus, the reference to an old black family property, these resonate like a whispered password. The audience recognizes Grimmauld Place, even if she refuses to name it. Hermione reads the file twice, then a third time, searching for a procedural flaw she can use as a veto. The forms are immaculate. Her own systems have made them so. To reject this operation is to admit that the entire architecture she has built is illegitimate. To approve it is to accept that her masterpiece of reform may now be a tactically lethal machine. Her quill hovers. For a long moment, the room is alpine in its silence. Then she signs, converting intent into legality, with a single movement of ink. We do not see the raid, we only see the memo fold itself, vanish into ministry circulation, and feel the chill of a new question settling over the war. When the brightest witch of her age optimizes oppression, whose blood does her efficiency actually save? Harry, Ron, and the ghost of a friend. Fractured bonds across a battlefield. The memo vanishes into the veins of the ministry. The consequences do not. What it buys, paradoxically, is a meeting. They choose neutral ground with the methodical certainty of people who no longer trust coincidence. A disused Wizengamot antechamber, wards layered until the air itself feels heavy. On one side of the long table, the Order, Harry, Ron, Kingsley, Molly, Arthur, 2 shell-shocked members of the Old Guard. On the other, Hermione in official robes, the new seal of magical law enforcement stitched over her heart, flanked by auras who have raided safe houses Harry once slept in. In this timeline, the girl who used to arrive breathless to the common room now arrives precisely on time, parchment folder in hand, every movement broadcasting institutional authority. Harry does not see his friend. He sees the human face of the fortress that has been hunting him through alleyway and field. The silence between them has weight. It is alpine again. The first fracture is simple. Harry asks for names. He wants classified lists of Death Eater sympathizers in the department, schedules of raids, the internal map of who is stalling reform and who is quietly facilitating blood purges. He frames it as coordination, but everyone at the table hears the subtext. Give the resistance the ministry's nervous system. Hermione's answer is equally simple. No. If she breaks protocol, she is finished, discredited, removed from the levers of power, replaced by someone who will sign those same memos without hesitation. Both of them invoke the greater good. Both of them believe the other is being reckless. They are wrong. Ron is less careful. He slams his fist on the table, voice cracking as he calls her a bureaucrat, hiding behind parchment while people die in barns and back rooms because the ministry arrived 10 minutes too early or too late. Hermione does not flinch. She fires back that their improvisation has already cost lives they never counted. Informants burned, families exposed by sloppy security, children orphaned because someone could not keep a secret under verite serum. War, she says, is not just bravery. It is logistics, written in blood. The Weasleys fracture along an old, quiet fault line. Arthur, who has spent a lifetime threading conscience through procedure, recognizes the grim logic of her position. He even, in a low voice, defends her right to try. Molly sees none of that. She sees the girl who sat at her kitchen table and is now signing warrants against her sons. Forgiveness does not even enter the room. Yet beneath the clash of doctrine, Hermione is still Hermione. She does not hand over the ministry's nervous system, but she nudges it. A misfiled raid time here, a delayed warrant there, a subtle correction to a map that lets the Order step around a trap rather than into it. Her sabotage is tactically lethal in its restraint. She will not cross certain lines. No direct leak of informant names, no outright destruction of evidence. And to those living underground, That boundary feels indistinguishable from betrayal. The meeting ends as it always would, not with agreement, but with an offer. Harry, eyes tired in a way that has nothing to do with age, tells her she can walk out with them now. Leave the marble corridors, the laws, the files, the illusion of control, and return to the raw uncertainty of open resistance. For a heartbeat, her gaze flickers over the room, the ledgers of power only she can read, the machinery she believes is still a masterpiece, to be molded rather than smashed. She says, no. The door closes behind her with the finality of a spell. The camera lingers on Harry's face as the realization settles. He has not lost her to death, but to conviction, to a different theory of how to win this war. What none of them yet see is the quieter horror taking shape in parallel. How many futures will be written and erased by the quill she refuses to put down? Enforcing the unjust, Hermione as the Ministry's reluctant executioner. The horror arrives not with a scream, but with a docket number. Weeks after that door closes, Hermione sits beneath the enchanted ceiling of a Ministry tribunal chamber, the air thick with parchment dust and the brittle silence of rehearsed justice. She is not the judge, not yet. She is the clever advisor at the side of power, quill poised, eyes sharp, brought in to ensure procedural integrity in this timeline. They are wrong. Her presence does not cleanse the process, it perfects it. The panel convenes to review questionable registrations, Muggle-borns whose paperwork is incomplete, purebloods whose politics are inconvenient, families branded sympathetic to the resistance. Hermione tells herself she is here as a shield, that every clause she cites and every precedent she resurrects is a weapon turned sideways, deflecting rather than striking. Yet with each case she annotates, the tribunal gains a veneer of fairness that makes its outcomes easier to accept, easier to enforce, easier to forget. Consider the girl who steps forward on a rain-slick Thursday, robes too large, hands shaking around a cracked wand. She is 15, bright, terrified, with a Muggle dentist for a father and a stack of school essays that read like Hermione's own first-year work. The sole resonance is immediate. This could have been her if the war's geometry had shifted half an inch. The lead examiner, a man who quotes educational decree numbers like scripture, leans in and asks the question that matters. By what right do you possess magic? Hermione has already seen the loophole. A forgotten subpublic in the Muggle-born Registration Act allows provisional clearance for those who have rendered extraordinary service to Ministry security operations. The girl once reported a suspicious package at King's Cross. With a few strokes of the quill, Hermione could inflate that into extraordinary service and secure a full release. But doing so would expose the quiet pattern in her recommendations, the statistical skew toward mercy that any tactically lethal mind on the other side will eventually notice. So she chooses a lesser salvation. She frames the girl as low risk, high monitoring value, recommends placement in a controlled settlement, rather than Azkaban, dresses exile as protection. The panel nods, relieved to appear balanced. The sentence is passed. A life is not destroyed, merely contained, relocated to a fenced village where wands are registered nightly and curfews fall like wards. Hermione walks out, telling herself the calculation was sound, a masterpiece of damage control within a corrupted fortress of law. After all, has she not always done this? She once wiped her parents' memories for their safety, blackmailed Rita Skeeter into silence, weaponized the rules of a corrupt press to serve a higher cause. In this tribunal chamber, that same ends justify means instinct is amplified by institutional authority. What was once a schoolgirl's improvisation has become a system's methodical certainty. The section closes on her office late. Stacks of files loom like gravestones, each name reduced to a summary, each fate distilled to a signature line. Hermione signs. One, then another, ink flowing with the quiet finality of a curse. No wand is raised, no spell pronounced, yet the consequences are binding, harder than iron, colder than any alpine stone. When she finally pushes back her chair, she washes her hands in the tiny ministry sink, scrubbing until the skin reddens. The water runs clear, the stain does not. And outside, the war adapts to the new weapon being polished in the dark. Not a boy with a wand, but a woman with a quill. The ministry's dark mirror, Voldemort's regime, upgraded by Hermione's order. Hermione believes, with the brittle conviction of someone already in too deep, that better laws will mean a better war. The wizarding world will call Voldemort's return a coup, a night of masks and green light. They are wrong. In this timeline, his resurrection lands not on a fractured bureaucracy, but on a ministry honed by her reforms into a cold, humming machine. It is not a palace sacked by barbarians. It is a hostile merger in which an ancient hatred silently acquires a modern administration and keeps the brand. The mechanism is almost elegant. Hermione's registries for magical creatures, designed to prevent abuse and trafficking, already map bloodlines, habitats, and movement corridors with methodical certainty. When the Muggle-born Registration Commission appears, it does not arrive as Umbridge's crude invention. It simply repoints an existing spine of data. The categories change, the fields narrow, the access widens. What once tracked Kneasel breeders now tracks children. Her standardized enforcement protocols, drafted to restrain overzealous auras, become tactically lethal in the wrong hands. Response times are optimized, chains of command clarified, authorizations pre-signed for emergency security events. When the first coordinated raids begin, there is no flailing chaos, no contradictory orders. Doors open, wands rise, targets vanish into holding cells whose existence is fully documented and entirely unchallengeable. Out of this fusion grows something new, not merely Voldemort, but the Ministry of the Serpent, a regime where soul resonance with fear is carried not by skull-masked figures in the street, but by parchment. The true terror is an owl at dawn, an envelope bearing the familiar crest, its language impeccably polite as it announces confiscations, relocations, audits. The dark mark becomes almost redundant. The real brand is the official seal pressed into red wax. Hermione's role inside this evolving fortress of authority is paradoxical. She is too competent to discard, too publicly principled to simply disappear. The Serpent keeps her invisible departments, regulation, then law enforcement, positioning her as the face of reasonable measures. the witch who insists every decree include oversight clauses, appeal windows, procedural safeguards that rarely, in practice, save anyone. The brutality is outsourced to subcommittees, to contractors, to nameless enforcement squads, whose reports cross her desk in sanitized summaries. Pattern interrupt. She is not secretly leading a resistance cell from within. A weapon being polished in the dark can also be pointed the wrong way. She pushes back where she can, dilutes language, inserts delays, rescues edge cases. Lives are saved in footnotes, yet every compromise tightens the lattice, refines the serpent's coils. The world outside sees fewer massacres in open streets, less visible war. Inside, surveillance deepens until the silence itself feels watched. Is this upgraded ministry better or worse than the chaos of canon? Fewer bodies on the cobblestones, perhaps, but more people living in cages whose bars are legal clauses she herself has written. Cracks in the fortress. The moment Hermione's faith in the system falters, the ledger only holds as long as the entries stay abstract. It collapses the first night the ministry orders a village erased. They name it a preventive security sweep, a neutral phrase that tastes like parchment and dust. In this timeline, a Muggle-born enclave on the Welsh border, families Hermione personally registered into a protected status pilot scheme, simply vanishes from the rolls. No arrests logged, no trials scheduled, just a sealed memo from magical law enforcement and a spike of Obliviator overtime. The cobblestones are clean. The silence is not. Hermione reads the casualty summary 3 times with the methodical certainty of someone hunting for a clerical error that will restore the world to sense. There is none. Her own pilot scheme, the careful wording she fought for as a humane shield, non-discretionary review, mandatory warrant thresholds, has been cited as legal precedent to justify the sweep. Her protections have become a weapon being polished in the dark. Driven by a cold, almost academic terror, she goes deeper. The file is not in her office. It lives 3 security layers down in an Aurora-only archive she is not meant to access. She bypasses it anyway, exploiting a loophole she once designed to help Kingsley audit corruption. Behind the wards, she finds not just the directive authorizing the massacre, but something more corrosive, an internal briefing on public integration assets. Hermione Granger occupies the top of the list. The document does not speak of partnership or shared authority. It tracks her appearances, her speeches about responsible reform, her carefully negotiated compromises, and tags them with impact metrics: dissent reduction in key districts, order recruitment fall-off, international confidence stabilization. Her memos are reproduced with margin notes, mocking, precise, tactically lethal. If Granger will sign this, we can sell anything. The Slytherin timeline pays dividends. Even Gryffindors bend. Her life's work is logged as proof that resistance is unnecessary because the brightest witch of her age has already accepted the new order. They are wrong, she tells herself, with a stubbornness that feels like drowning. She is mitigating. She is buying time. She is preventing open war. Then she turns the page and finds a name. Megan Towler, Muggle-born, minor, deceased. Cause of death: complications during relocation under Statute 7B. Hermione remembers her as a first year with ink-stained fingers, a girl she once tutored in the library because no one had explained the trace to her Muggle parents. Statute 7B is Hermione's law, a relocation framework she drafted to prevent disappearances without records. The report is brutally clear. Compliance delays, overcrowded holding cells, non-essential healers reassigned. Administrative pressure, not Death Eaters, killed the girl. The fortress of statutes in her mind finally cracks. She read her own clauses and sees, with new and merciless clarity, the blood in the margins. Every elegant definition, every limitation she accepted to keep a worse version of the books, now glows with soul resonance she cannot unfeel. Her academic detachment, once her armor resolves into something uglier, complicity rendered in legalese. That night, the Ministry atrium is a cavern of green fire and polished stone. Hermione stands before a flue grate, badge in one hand, wand in the other, the world's most disciplined bureaucrat, trembling like a first year before the sorting hat. One destination leads back to her office. More meetings, more memos, more mitigation inside a machine that has learned to weaponize her conscience. The other is a rarely used address written in Ron's untidy scrawl years ago. A safe house she has never dared to step into. The flames roar, emerald and hungry. She breathes once, twice, and steps forward. The scene ends before we see which way she turns. Back to the war room, Hermione's negotiation with the Resistance. She chooses both. In this timeline, the neutral ground is not a metaphor. It is brick, dust, and stale air. The address Ron scrawled years ago opens into a long-abandoned Order safe house, its wards frayed but still functional, floating like a derelict fortress between the Ministry's authority and the Resistance's desperation. Hermione steps out of the emerald flames with her wand already in hand. Across the room, 3 wands are waiting for her. This is not a reunion of friends. It is a summit between rival states. Harry stands at the center of the far wall, not in school robes but in hardened leathers charmed against curses, the casual savagery of war etched into his posture. Ron flanks him, shoulders set, jaw tight. Kingsley occupies the corner like an anchor, calm and watchful, his presence the only reminder that the Order once believed in procedure. They expect Hermione Granger, supplicant and penitent, begging for absolution. They are wrong. She lays a leather folio on the table between them with methodical certainty, never breaking eye contact. Inside, copied access sigils for the atrium wards, rota schedules for oral patrols, draft decrees annotated in her precise hand, with vulnerabilities circled in red. She does not apologize. She briefs. Her voice is clipped, professional, almost clinically detached, as she outlines the Ministry's new Muggle-born registration framework, its enforcement chains, its weak links. This is not confession, it is weaponization. Years of compromise crystallize into a tactically lethal map of the enemy's nervous system. Harry listens, arms folded, his silence heavier than any accusation. Ron cannot manage the same restraint. His questions cut sideways. Why now? What changed? Where were you when the raid started? And each one drags the conversation back toward betrayal. The war room becomes a courtroom by reflex. Kingsley intervenes with the ease of a man who has negotiated ceasefires and executions in the same breath. He reframes the moment. Hermione is not a prodigal friend, but a defector with high-value intelligence. A weapon being polished in the dark by the very institution they are trying to topple. The Slytherin timeline has taught him that sentiment is a luxury. Leverage is not. Hermione sets her terms with the same precision she once used to answer exam questions, in exchange for full access to her intelligence cache, for coordinated sabotage of key enforcement offices, and for legal challenges seeded into obscure subclauses that can quietly gut entire decrees. She demands operational autonomy, no field orders, no public association, and, crucially, an absolute moratorium on announcing her defection until she has repositioned her embedded sympathizers inside key departments. She calls it what it is, a Trojan horse strategy. On parchment, she will remain a loyal ministry official, drafting regulations, tightening procedures, speaking with the cool authority of someone who believes in the rule of law. In practice, she will lace those same regulations with delayed detonations, ambiguous wording, jurisdictional conflicts, sunset clauses that look like bureaucratic oversight until they ignite. Harry hears the plan and recognizes its brilliance. He also recognizes its cost. To use her as a masterpiece, to be molded into this role, is to accept that Hermione has become a different kind of weapon, one that corrodes from the inside rather than strikes from the outside. Ron's sole resonance with the girl he followed through forests and battlefields clashes with the woman who now negotiates like a ministry undersecretary. The pact, when it is finally spoken aloud, feels less like reconciliation and more like an armistice between factions that no longer fully trust each other. As Hermione seals it with a whispered charm over the folio, the viewer is left with a question that hangs in the stale air of the safe house. Has she finally turned against the system that claimed her, or is she quietly constructing a new world in her own image, hidden inside the old one, like a curse inside a statute? Paper cuts and sabotage, Hermione's covert war inside the ministry. By the time the incommat folio dries, Hermione has already divided herself cleanly in two. By daylight, she is the ministry's model prodigy. By night, she is a weapon being polished in the dark, honed not for duels, but for footnotes. In the fluorescent stillness of Level 2, she moves with methodical certainty, meetings, briefings, carefully calibrated deference to authority. She argues for efficiency, legal clarity, and procedural integrity with a calm that reassures even the most paranoid undersecretary. In this timeline, the brightest witch of her age does not storm the fortress from outside. She learns every corridor, every filing system, every gap where silence can be stretched into a shield. Her real war is waged in margins and subclauses, an emergency power drafted to allow warrantless raids on Muggle-born safe houses acquires, under her quill, a sunset clause so densely cross-referenced that no one notices it will self-terminate in 6 weeks unless renewed by a full Wizengamot vote. A deportation protocol for non-compliant magical creatures gains a contradictory definition of sentient resident, imported from an obscure pre-war goblin treaty that no Death Eater functionary has ever read. On parchment, it looks like a masterpiece of harmonization. In practice, It gives any half-competent advocate grounds to freeze proceedings for months. She misfiles too, but never sloppily. A single digit transposed in an internal routing code sends a stack of raid warrants to the Department of Magical Transportation instead of Auror headquarters, where they sit in an in-tray designed for portkey audits. A memo reallocating enforcement squads away from the eastern valleys, where an order-safe corridor runs like a hidden alpine pass, is justified with fabricated incident data and a persuasive chart. It is dry, bureaucratic sabotage, tactically lethal precisely because it looks so boring. The cost is written on her face in the bathroom mirror. At 2 a.m. she is burning through herself. Nights spent redrafting clauses by wandlight until the words blur. Days spent enforcing a system whose victims sometimes have faces she recognizes from Hogwarts. There is a dark satisfaction in turning the machine's own logic against it, in feeling the resonance of power bend under her hand. There is also the knowledge that one misstep will not merely end her, but expose every corridor she has carved for others. The near discovery comes on an ordinary Thursday, which is how real danger usually arrives. A Death Eater-leaning deputy from magical law enforcement, Thaddeus Rowell, all cold politeness and immaculate ink, halts by her desk with a stack of parchment. "Granger," he says, voice light. "Curious pattern in your dockets. Raids in the northern districts delayed 3 times. Deportation orders for goblin collaborators. Unusually entangled." He lays down 2 files whose contradictions are not supposed to be visible to the naked eye. For a heartbeat, the office becomes a fortress with its walls closing in. Hermione does not reach for her wand. She reaches for her reputation. With a controlled exhale, she leans over the parchment, brow furrowing in what looks like offended perfectionism. "Exactly," she replies, and the word lands like a challenge. These forms were drafted in 3 separate eras with incompatible definitions of combatant and resident. If we push through mass actions on this basis, any half-awake solicitor will tear us apart in review. I've been standardizing the language to prevent appeals. Unless, she adds mildly, you prefer public reversals. Rowell hesitates. The regime values brutality, but it also fears humiliation. After a moment, he snorts, half amused, half irritated. "Very well. Clean it up. Just don't slow us down." He walks away. The war does not explode in that corridor. It simply continues. The pattern interrupt is almost insultingly small. A Muggle-born family in Cardiff waits for the knock that never comes, because their warrant is trapped in a procedural clarification Hermione requested on page 7 of a policy memo. A half-legal creature sanctuary in the Pennines remains untouched, its coordinates misprinted in a registry she updated late at night. We end not on a duel, but on Hermione alone at her desk, as the office empties, staring at a single returned file stamped "Action deferred, insufficient basis." Her shoulders sag, the fatigue of a war fought in paper cuts pressing down. Then, slowly, a small, tired smile appears. In this world, a misprinted form is an act of rebellion, and Hermione Granger has an endless supply of ink. The showdown of strategies. Hermione versus Voldemort's Inner circle. The action deferred stamp is not the end of the story. It is the reason the Dark Lord's inner circle convenes. Within days, those deferred actions, those missing warrants and delayed raids, calcify into what the Death Eaters call administrative sabotage. The war, they insist, is being lost in parchment. They are wrong, but the perception is enough to summon Hermione into the lion's den. The high-ceilinged council chamber has been stripped of its pretense of democracy. The Wizengamot benches are half empty, draped in banners that now carry the serpent skull sigil rather than the ministry crest. Around the central table, Voldemort's primary lieutenants argue in overlapping snarls about bottlenecks, non-compliant departments, and blood traitor clerks who keep misfiling orders. At the far end, in a deliberate echo of the old world, Hermione stands alone with a stack of files, the last fragile silhouette of procedure in a room built for war. This is the showdown of strategies. Brute terror versus methodical certainty. The Death Eaters speak in threats and curses, promising mass arrests and public executions as remedies for bureaucratic decay. Hermione answers in clauses and subsections, each response a quiet indictment. She points out that mass purges of staff have already reduced processing capacity by 32%. That overuse of emergency decrees erodes the illusion of legality that keeps foreign ministries neutral, that even a tyranny must obey its own rules if it wishes to claim authority rather than mere occupation. In this timeline, her fluency in the ministry's legal architecture is tactically lethal. She does not plead for mercy, she frames restraint as a weapon. A slower, cleaner rollout of blood status verification, she argues, will produce fewer forged identities and less black market documentation. Targeted confiscations will generate more wealth than indiscriminate looting. Every moral horror is translated into the language of efficiency until cruelty itself becomes a spreadsheet. The tension spikes when one lieutenant, a known legilimens, grows bored of her measured tone and simply raises his wand. The chamber falls into a predatory silence as he reaches for her mind, expecting the flinch of a frightened bureaucrat. What he finds instead is a curated gallery, memories of late nights at her desk, of correcting forms, of nodding along to policy briefings, a masterpiece to be moulded, apparently, into the perfect functionary. He presses harder, searching for treachery, and meets only loyal pragmatism, cool and exhausted. The surface is seamless. They are wrong again. What he cannot see is the alpine fortress she has built behind that facade. Occlumency honed not against a benevolent headmaster, but against interrogators who measure value in screams. The cost of that mask arrives in the next breath. Cornered by accusations of softness, Hermione publicly endorses a new measure: accelerated property seizures from non-compliant, muggle-born families with children reassigned to state guardianship. The words taste like poison, yet she lays out implementation steps with clinical precision, because to object now would expose every delay she has engineered. Somewhere, listening through a sympathetic clerk or a stolen transcript, the resistance hears her voice advocating the theft of children and feels a sickening soul resonance of betrayal. From the outside, it looks like conversion. From the inside, it feels like self-amputation. The session should end there. It doesn't. As the council disperses, Voldemort's primary lieutenant, whether Bellatrix in this Slytherin timeline or another favoured monsterlingers, with a smile but has nothing to do with policy, they hand Hermione a sealed folder and a verbal order. She is to personally oversee the first wave of seizures, beginning with a target selected for motivational value. The name inside the folder belongs to someone she still loves. The scene cuts on Hermione's face as she reads it, every layer of her constructed loyalty straining. We do not yet see whether the weapon being polished in the dark will obey, sabotage, or finally shatter her own disguise. The breaking point. Choosing between coup and continuity, the wizarding world operates under a comforting illusion in this timeline that revolutions announce themselves with banners and battle cries, that one can see the breaking point coming. They are wrong. It arrives for Hermione alone, in a locked office 3 floors beneath street level, with 2 mutually exclusive futures spread across her desk like dueling prophecy scrolls. By now, the resistance is no longer a rumour whispered in nocturne back rooms. It is tactically lethal, coordinated, and, though most would never suspect it, fed by the quiet fractures Hermione has been carving into the Ministry's foundations. Missing arrest warrants, misfiled surveillance reports, wards calibrated a fraction of a degree off true north. Each act insignificant on its own, but together, a weapon being polished in the dark. In this moment, all of that incremental sabotage converges into a single, horrifyingly clean request. Disable the core defensive lattice for exactly 17 minutes, and the Ministry fortress becomes vulnerable enough for a decisive strike. The plan is brutal and elegant. Hermione alone can ghost past the layered protections she helped design, can invert the soul resonance keys that tie the Atrium's wards to the blood-bonded elite. If she proceeds, the resistance will pour in, decapitate the regime, and drag its symbols of authority into the light. She will almost certainly die, exposed as the inside architect of their undoing. So will many others. Clerks, interns, enchanted security constructs that only partially remember they were once auras. The alternative lies in the second dossier, a soft transition written in her precise, unflinching hand. Maneuver Kingsley and other moderates into pivotal posts. Quietly retire the worst enforcers and let abhorrent decrees wither under procedural review. No storming of halls, no rivers of blood in the marble corridors, only committee minutes and revised bylaws. Over 5, 10, 20 years, the regime would molt its most grotesque skins while preserving its skeleton. The war ends not with a bang, but with a reshuffled seating chart. Here, the ledger returns. On one side, a coup that ends the war in an afternoon at the cost of chaos, power vacuums, and the near certainty that some new strongman will claim the ruins. On the other, continuity, methodical certainty, and generations living under institutions whose birth certificate is written in terror, even if the ink fades to bureaucratic grey. In her mind, the dead and the living convene. Harry, as he was in the Gryffindor common room, insists that you do not negotiate with monsters. You break their wands and their windows, and their will. Kingsley, tempered by years inside this same machine, counters that the world cannot survive perpetual purges. that someone must keep the lights on while ideals argue. And then her younger self speaks, the first year who believed rules were the spine of civilization, asking when exactly the rulebook became a shield for cowards. When the quill finally moves, it is with terrifying speed. 2 plans, written in full. 1, a surgical strike that will shatter the ministry's core. 1, a controlled handover that will leave the building standing while its occupants quietly change. Hermione steps to the enchanted brazier, holds both parchments over the flame, and releases one. Ash spirals upward. The other plan she folds, pockets, and wards against detection. The camera never shows which survived. The narration withholds the answer with clinical cruelty. In the Slytherin timeline, we do not begin with choices. We begin with consequences, and only then work backwards to the moment a single witch decided what kind of world deserved to endure. Aftermath and architecture. The world Hermione leaves behind. When the smoke finally clears, the ministry does not lie in heroic ruins. It stands. That is the first indictment of this world, and of Hermione's choice. In this timeline, the atrium is not rebuilt from ashes, but merely renovated, polished, its scars hidden under tasteful charms and new brass plaques that insist the war has ended and order has prevailed. Where once the fountain of magical brethren loomed in smug bronze, a new installation occupies the central pool, a ring of wands, lowered, tips extinguished, encircling a stylized phoenix mid-flight. The inscription reads, "Unity through law, not freedom, not justice, law." Around the walls, enchanted banners scroll through the names of the fallen, but the eye is drawn instead to the glowing text of the latest decrees, rotating in the air with methodical certainty, as if grief itself has been converted into policy. Look closer, and her fingerprints are everywhere. The Muggle-Born Protection Act, Section 3, prohibits discriminatory hiring practices and criminalizes blood status slurs in official proceedings. Hermione drafted the language herself, arguing the precise definition of systemic prejudice until Wizengamot elders capitulated out of exhaustion and unease. A decade later, auras operate under the Granger protocols, mandatory body-bind review charms on all field engagements, automatic pensieve audits for use of unforgivables, and an independent oversight panel with goblin and centaur representation. Magical creatures, once dismissed as beasts or beings by bureaucratic whim, now invoke the Granger Accords to demand land rights and treaty enforcement. Even her enemies admit the architecture of rights has her cadence. They are wrong, however, to imagine those rights came without a price, because in a quiet annex off level 2, the old Muggle-Born Registration Commission has not been destroyed. It has been renamed. The Registry of Magical Risk now catalogues voluntary disclosures of high-intensity magic, wand signatures, and bloodline anomalies. The quills are gentler. The ink no longer carves into skin, but the ledgers are fuller than ever. Surveillance charms lace the visitor's entrance, justified by the spectre of post-war instability, their detection grids humming with a familiar, tactically lethal precision. This is Hermione's shadow infrastructure, a weapon being polished in the dark, designed to ensure that no Death Eater network can ever reconstitute, yet equally capable of tracking dissidents, radicals, and inconvenient visionaries. The line between safety and control has not vanished. It has been legalized. Different factions narrate this legacy as if describing different witches. To former Aurors who watched her dismantle pureblood immunity clause by clause, she is the hero who infiltrated the beast and cut out its heart, turning the ministry from fortress of denial into a grudgingly accountable authority. To those who remember her signature on early curfews, on emergency detention orders, on the temporary extension of Dementor deployment within strictly monitored parameters, she is a collaborator whose sole resonance with power came far too easily. In Hogwarts classrooms, younger witches and wizards study her casebooks the way others once studied Dumbledore's theories, not as scripture, but as a masterpiece to be moulded, debated, and, if they are honest, feared. Pattern interrupt. The curriculum does not ask whether she was right. It asks students to draft alternative decrees and defend them under simulated war conditions. What would you sacrifice if the next Voldemort rose from your year? The section closes, years after the last battle, on a near-empty office in magical law enforcement. A trainee sits alone, the corridors beyond wrapped in late evening silence, reading Hermione Granger's archived files. They trace each annotation, each razor-edged compromise, with something like awe. Then the camera settles on one parchment, a still-active decree authorizing the indefinite monitoring of high-risk magical minors. Signed in her precise hand, the trainee hesitates, admiration curdling into unease. The quill hovers. Does one revoke the safeguard or sharpen it? The image holds. Her legacy does not resolve into triumph or condemnation. It remains an open file waiting for the next hand to sign. Hermione Granger, hero, traitor, or tragic bureaucrat. The file in the trainee's hand is not just a relic of procedure, it is a map of a moral journey. To understand what that signature means, the Slytherin timeline forces us to trace Hermione's arc in 3 movements, each one a recalibration rather than a clean break, each one framed by her methodical certainty that she is doing the least wrong available. In the first phase, she enters the ministry as an idealistic insider. This is the Hermione who once knitted hats for house elves and founded SPEW, now armed with departmental letterhead and access to drafting rooms. In this timeline, she chooses magical law enforcement over creature regulation precisely because it is closer to the levers of war and blood policy. She believes that proximity to power is the only rational position for someone who understands the stakes. When she helps design a registry for Muggleborns, she insists on clauses about due process, oversight, and appeal. She tells herself that, without her, the registry will be a weapon being polished in the dark. The second phase begins when those safeguards are quietly suspended. Hermione, now a senior undersecretary, finds her humane language invoked to justify raids and detentions she never intended. She becomes a compromised enforcer. She sits on tribunals that review Muggle-born cases, sometimes commuting sentences, sometimes bartering reduced penalties for information. Was drafting a less cruel law an act of mercy or collaboration? Did her presence in those rooms save more lives than it legitimized? The people who call her a traitor point to the robes she wears and the seals she applies. They are wrong, she tells herself. What they cannot see is the alternative decree waiting in a drawer, the one that would have authorized summary execution. The third phase is not marked by a resignation letter, but by a change in vector. Hermione turns covert saboteur while remaining inside the fortress. She leaks schedules to underground networks, misfiles warrants, and engineers bureaucratic dead ends that allow certain prisoners to vanish from the system. To her, this is soul resonance with the girl who once broke into Gringotts and the Ministry for Harry's sake. The methods are different, the calculus colder, but the impulse to protect is the same. Yet every day she walks past portraits that praise her efficiency. Every day her reforms make the machine of oppression more tactically lethal, even as she slips sand into the gears. Here the moral grey zones widen. Reformers who work inside flawed institutions, whistleblowers who one day turn against the offices they once defended. History is full of such figures, and in this timeline, Hermione is one more name in that uneasy lineage. Most oppressive regimes do not run on cartoon villains. They run on intelligent, well-meaning people who believe, as she does, that their presence mitigates the damage. At what point does staying become endorsement? At what point does leaving become abdication of responsibility? The video does not answer. It leaves you in the silence between those questions and that unsigned decree. If you had Hermione's mind and her options, open rebellion with higher immediate risk, or infiltration with a higher risk of moral corrosion, which path would you take? And when the war finally forces her to choose between the Ministry's authority and the remnants of the resistance, which side of the door do you believe she stands on when the wards begin to fall? Rewrite in canon how one career choice reshapes the wizarding world. The answer, in this timeline, is not a campfire outside a tent, but a desk that becomes a front line. Canon gives us a clean narrative fulcrum. Voldemort falls to a boy. The Ministry stumbles. The trio matures into a mobile improvisational resistance that ultimately topples both Dark Lord and bureaucratic rot. They are wrong to assume that removing Hermione from that battlefield merely weakens Harry's chances. It does something colder. It changes the architecture of power itself. Begin with Voldemort's fall. In the original war, his defeat is almost mythic chaos. Wands flashing in corridors, house elves charging, centaurs breaking the tree line. The walls of Hogwarts acting as a last stand fortress rather than a state institution. Here, the end, if it comes at all, arrives through ledgers, warrants, and quiet disappearances. Hermione's quill, not Harry's wand, is the weapon being polished in the dark. The Ministry does not crumble after victory. It ossifies, reinforced by the precedents she has drafted to constrain Death Eaters and, unintentionally, everyone else. The difference is visible in who feels safe after the war. Canon's aftermath, for all its scars, pushes Muggle-borns and magical creatures toward visibility and legal recognition. Hermione's later reforms ride a wave of moral momentum. In this timeline, those same names appear not on liberation charters, but on registries, exemptions, and temporary emergency provisions that never fully sunset. House elves gain subclauses, goblins gain committees, werewolves gain supervised districts. It is progress rendered in grayscale, a masterpiece to be molded by someone who now understands that every protection can be inverted into a leash. Strip Hermione from the trio's day-to-day struggle, and the emotional resonance of their story fractures. In canon, she is the methodical certainty that drags Harry and Ron back from the brink, the moral anchor who insists that saving Buckbeak matters as much as defeating Dementors. Without that anchor, Harry's crusade against Horcruxes leans harder into desperation and rage. Ron's loyalty curdles more easily into resentment and fatalism. Their victories, when they happen, are tactically lethal but strategically wasteful. More bodies, fewer plans, an improvisational war fought without the soul resonance of a shared ethical compass. The Order of the Phoenix changes as well. Deprived of Hermione's early logistics and research, it retreats into its original posture. Older, slower, brave but reactive. Molly Weasley wards kitchens instead of coordinating networks. Lupin and Kingsley chase rumours instead of patterns. When Hermione finally intersects with them as a Ministry insider, the Order evolves into something sharper yet, compromised, relying on classified memos and procedural sabotage. Every operation now carries a double edge. Each success deepens their dependence on the very institution they claim to resist. And the Ministry itself, so often played in canon as bumbling, cowardly, almost farcical, hardens into a more competent, terrifying adversary. With Hermione optimizing case flows, standardizing Aurora protocols, and quietly killing the most egregious bloodstoots, the regime becomes less visibly monstrous and more enduring. Corruption is no longer theatrical, it is efficient. The world does not see a cartoon villain like Umbridge unchecked. It sees a calibrated system in which even Umbridge is constrained, redirected, made useful. This is the epic cost of one career choice: tent or office, wand or quill, rebellion or reform. By watching Hermione choose the Ministry first, the Slytherin timeline exposes how precarious her canon rebellion truly was, and how easily the brightest witch of her age could have become the most necessary architect of a softer, more survivable tyranny. Because once you have proven that the system can work, even a little, who will dare to burn it down? Closing the file. Your verdict on Hermione's Ministry timeline. Which brings us back to that first, deceptively quiet fracture. A single letter delivered not to a muddy tent and a Horcrux hunt, but to a cramped, post-war flat, offering Hermione Granger a trainee post in magical law. The world calls it a promotion, a natural step for the brightest witch of her age. They are wrong. In this timeline, that envelope is a port key into a different war. From there, the beats fall like stamped forms. The first compromise signed in ink, when she authorizes a temporary Muggle-born registration statute to keep them traceable during raids. The tribunal where she weighs lives against laws, watching a terrified werewolf mother plead, while precedent demands her children be marked. The secret meetings with the resistance in abandoned courtrooms, parchment spread like battle maps, her voice cold as she explains which decrees can be sabotaged without collapsing the entire Ministry fortress. And then, the final choice we never quite see, only infer in the silence of the epilogue, the memo she drafts or refuses to draft. That decides whether post-war Britain becomes a softer tyranny with better fonts, or a fragile republic with the memory of chains etched into every corridor. Across this Slytherin timeline, Hermione is both savior and collaborator, architect of oppression and liberation in the same exhausted body. That ambiguity is not a flaw to be resolved. It is the core engine of this narrative, the soul resonance that makes her more than a slogan. She is the girl who once knitted hats in Gryffindor Tower, now calculating how many werewolves can be spared without collapsing a coalition. A weapon being polished in the dark by procedure, precedent, and fear. So, your file is open in front of you now. What is your verdict? Is this Hermione a hero who did what was necessary, sacrificing her own moral clarity so others could keep theirs intact? A traitor who chose authority, office hours, and controlled power over the raw honesty of open rebellion? Or a tragic bureaucrat crushed between intention and outcome, whose brilliance made her methodical certainty more dangerous than any Death Eater's wand? Mark your answer in the comments and defend it with evidence from her arc. Cite the registration law, the tribunal, the backroom meetings, the final, unseen memo. Then, push the timeline further. If this ministry-forged Hermione is offered the post-war Minister of Magic role, does she accept and finally dismantle the machine, or merely oil it with better ethics codes? When the next dark threat rises through gaps in the very system she designed, does she double down on control, or walk away and let the fortress fall? In this world, does she ever allow herself to become a masterpiece, to be molded by something other than fear? If you want more deep dive dissections of these hidden fault lines, more files pulled from the alternate archive of the Wizarding World, like this video, subscribe, and share it with the one friend who still believes Canon Hermione could never break. They are wrong, too. Next time, we open a new folder, another small, catastrophic choice by a core character, another tactically lethal divergence. Until then, close the file, but do not forget the signature at the bottom.